Hello, YouTube. So, what's going to follow here for this first video is actually going to be a re-recording of a lecture from the fall 2022 semester. I don't typically make my lecture videos. If I need to post one, I don't generally make them available to the public on my channel. The videos that you'll find public on my channel are just kind of supplementary videos that I create or stuff I do for fun and stuff like that. I started the channel specifically just to have a place to keep those kinds of videos for students. Never really intended on making any of the in-person courses like available into perpetuity on the platform. But this semester I decided to give it a shot with one of the 5 courses that I have for the fall 2022 semester. But the problem is that none of the classrooms are really set up for that kind of thing. None of them are distance education classrooms. So what I mostly do is I just record Zoom meetings and kind of catch the lecture and screen as I go. It's something I didn't do specifically to put on YouTube. It's something that I'm kind of doing for students as a measure of convenience, because my assumption is that despite the fact that the pandemic is largely over for most people, students tend to be a more vulnerable population. And my suspicion is that there's at least more than a few of them that are still struggling to kind of get back to some sense of normalcy, or are still struggling with issues from the pandemic, whether it's themselves or a loved one, or the various different economic issues that arose as a result of the pandemic and so on as well. But I figured since I was doing that for students that I would give it a try for the first time ever and put it up on YouTube as well. The problem is that because they're not set up as distance education classrooms, and I'm kind of jury-rigging things, I actually missed the first lecture of the semester, and I've caught all the ones since then. And typically I would not bother to re-record such a situation. But I figured if I'm going to put all of them up on YouTube, I might as well put them all up, even the one that I missed. So what this video is actually going to be a re-recording of the lecture, the first lecture from the Cybersecurity and Society class. And all the ones that follow afterwards are going to be live recordings. The only thing that I guess I request is that if you are interested in this, feel free to reach out to me with questions or concerns, or even if you have criticisms. But do keep in mind that this is not created for the YouTube audience. It is not created. This is an undergraduate course, so this is not created. This is not academic level discussions. These are not explorations into the idiosyncrasies and, I guess, pedantism of the field. This is just a focus on cybersecurity and society and technology and usage and so on. So you can also keep in mind that the quality is what it is, because I'm recording live lectures with the exception of this first one. So, I can't guarantee that things come through the way that they ought to all the time. So, all right. So with no further ado, let's do the first part, and then I can upload all of the rest of the parts that I already have. So we're talking about today here is the role of technology in society. So the internet is a big deal, obviously, but it's not the first technology that has been a big deal. There have been many instances in our history, our collective history, the legacy of humanity, where a technology or a group of technologies has changed the game completely. And when that happens, it's difficult to know when you're in the moment, but looking back, you can always say, wow, that changed everything for us. That was a huge deal. The best way of really getting a sense of that is taking a look at the artifacts of the day. And it wasn't that long ago that there was a very important invention that changed everything for us, that eventually led to the creation, or the ability to create the internet. Because as the saying goes, we stand on the shoulders of giants, or innovation stands on the shoulders of giants, right? One evolution follows another. And certain things simply wouldn't be possible without antecedent discoveries. Like, for example, we could not have the automobile if not for the invention of the internal combustion engine, and of course the refinement of petrol into gasoline, and even the invention of the wheel, if we went back far enough. Well, we could not have computers. We could not have the internet without computers. We could not have computers without electricity. And electricity was another invention that revolutionized society, changed everything, to the point where it was used as a marketing tool as well. Because there is an eponymous law called Clarke's Law, named after C. Arthur Clarke, the science fiction author, and it states that any technology, if sufficiently advanced, is indistinguishable from magic. Or another way of looking at it, if you don't know what a technology is capable of, then it could be capable of anything, or it is magic. And so, at the turn of the century, with the distribution of our current electrical infrastructure, this new invention did seem like magic. Light at the push of a button, with no need for match, no need for flame, much less heat, no less worry of running out of fuel or accidentally starting fires and so on. Not that that doesn't happen with electricity, but compared to open flame, it's no contest. So what else might this do? I mean, this is literally a miracle that our ancestors were experiencing, just from darkness, light, from nothing, something, and more than just the ability to generate light. Think about all the other things that electricity was doing at the time. So this was just coming out. So things like electricity can also drive motors, which can move people, and so on, right? So what else might it be capable of? Well, people didn't understand it, didn't appreciate it, but it was this miracle invention. So if it's capable of that, maybe it's capable of anything. And so you would see these patent medicines coming out here that would take advantage of the electricity craze, as you might say, to sell these products. Like, for example, electricity can do anything. It can even cure your neuralgia, your rheumatism, your colds, your influenza. It will make you better and thinner and faster and smarter, stronger, and so on. And we even see advertisers of the day taking advantage of the electricity craze by simply appending prefixes to products like electro something, right? And some of these companies are even still around today. If you're familiar with Electrolux vacuum cleaners, well, that just simply combined two words that people were really obsessed with at the time. Electro for electricity and lux for luxury, Electrolux. And, it was used to sell whatever product it happened to be because it was in the forefront of people's minds, and it was this new miracle invention. It was in the zeitgeist, as it's called, in the collective consciousness of the nation. And we can look back at history and we can think, well, these stupid primitives, they have no idea what they were doing with. It's like a cargo cult mentality where somebody comes around with a little bit of flash paper and makes a fireball, and all of a sudden everyone thinks they're a wizard. But I would argue that we're not so different from our ancestors, because our most recent invention has kind of generated this new prefix as well. Again, if something is capable of one thing and we don't understand how it works, then it's indistinguishable from magic and is therefore capable of anything. And so for a while, cyber as a prefix, it's still everywhere. We're still using it all over the place. And I'm actually really glad that cyber is the prefix that we settled on, because there are actually a number of iterations of prefixes that were experimented with in the lingual zeitgeist, I guess, that looked like may at one point have been the it prefix. Like, for example, we still use email. Well, for a while, anything seemed to be the prefix that was going to emerge. So we still use email, we still use e-waste, and so on. But thankfully, we're not sitting here talking about e-insurance or the e-security or e-warfare and stuff like that. And for a time, it also seemed like maybe the prefix I was going to be right? Because of the rise of Apple and their iPhone and iPod and so on. But that seemed to be because of their Apple's a vigorous defense of their trademarks didn't seem to really emerge beyond Apple and some Apple knockoff products. So cyber is the prefix that we use. And it's a perfectly appropriate prefix because at one time we did need to delineate between what was something conceptualized in this new online space and something that had traditionally been conceptualized in an offline space. Like, we needed to say cyber warfare to distinguish it from traditional warfare. And we needed to say cyber insurance to distinguish it from traditional, for example, accident insurance or liability insurance. And we needed to specify cybersecurity and cyber attack because it was different from traditional security or traditional attacks. But just like the prefix electro went passé when essentially everything became electrified, right? I don't need to tell you that I'm operating an electro computer. I don't need to tell you that I have an electro flashlight, and so on, because after a while we begin to take technology, even revolutionary technologies, for granted. I don't talk about going to flip my electro switch to turn on my electro light bulb, right? I take for granted that when I hit that switch, the light will come on, unless it doesn't, and then we are in a big trouble for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment. So at one point, these prefixes were necessary. They were necessary because they informed the public as to the nature of the product or the concept. It was important to advertisers to take advantage of these things, but it became passé when everything became electrified. And I would argue that we're currently on the cusp of the age, perhaps even mere days away, when the prefix cyber is passé, because there's not really a difference anymore between warfare and cyber warfare. All warfare these days is going to contain a cyber component. As I'm recording this, the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is currently at something of a stalemate, and Ukraine has just made some rather large returns in ways into their formerly held territory. The only reason that they were able to do that, and the only reason that the war in general has been going the direction that's been going in, is because of intelligence and because of cyber warfare, in conjunction with traditional warfare, including volunteer armies fighting on both sides, both in traditional sense, as in soldiers on the ground. An international force has come to the aid of Ukraine, but also in a cyber sense. The Ukrainian Free Cyber Army is out there fighting Russian hackers, that seek to disrupt Ukrainian systems. There is no difference. It's just a component now of warfare. Cybersecurity and physical security have long in the industry been tied together, more now than ever before, and that's certainly not ever going to change, at least not unless something dramatically changes in our society. Because anything that happens that affects cybersecurity affects the actual well-being and the actual security of the organization or the nation. I apologize. I also forgot to mention a moment ago that I have decided to record this while I'm still a little bit under the weather, so apologies for occasional pauses. So, a cyber attack is one that affects real people. It's no longer something that just happens in cyberspace. Everything that happens in cyberspace translates one way or another to the real world. All right, let's talk about what technology does for us. So, technology has a very clear origin. Necessity is the mother of invention. All technology exists to solve a problem. No technology is spawned from primordial chaos and exists until somebody finds a use for it. Things are invented to solve a problem. They're invented to do a thing. And all of those problems that technology solves, in one way or another, comes down to the issue of human work. Human work is the amount of labor and time that we invest to solve a problem via a current mean. So, for example, if I need water, then I need to do work to get it. Either I have to walk a great distance to a watering hole, and along with that walk, there's a significant labor and time investment just with the journey there and the journey back. There's going to also be a risk inherent with that as well. A risk that my mission will be unsuccessful, a risk that I may be attacked by an animal along the way, and so on. Now, I can solve that problem with the technology. I can, for example, dig a well. Digging a well is not something that other animals do. It is a technology. We have to understand certain things about geography, geology, and nature in order to understand where a well should be dug. And then, of course, being able to dig deep enough to dig a well is not something that's easily done with bare hands, and so we're going to need some kind of technology to facilitate the human work of digging as well. But if I dig that well, then I no longer need to worry about the trip, and then I can more easily fetch water. I don't need to take the risk anymore either. So essentially what I'm doing is I am reducing the human work. I'm expending human work in the short term, but I'm reducing it overall because I'm greatly improving my ability to get water in the future. Now, taking that tact comes with its own risk. I might dig a well and not find water. Then I've expended human work, and I still don't have anything to show for it at the end of the day. Well, that's just the nature of technology. That's the nature of innovation. Now, we do this because human beings are actually really bad at most things. We're really bad at repetitive tasks, for example. Our bodies simply aren't built for them. That's why we wear out. We get repetitive stress injuries. We are really bad at calculating things. At least in terms of like complex, multifaceted calculations. We can usually do simple calculations fairly intuitively, but not many of us have genius-level math skills. We just don't. There's a spectrum of human intelligence, and not everyone has that. That doesn't necessarily mean that certain humans are less worthy of survival than others. We are also really bad at remembering things, generally speaking. We have a pretty interesting way of assimilating information, but raw memory and perfect recall are definite weaknesses of our memory systems. What we are really good at are things that are creative and cognitive. This is as John Adams said during the Revolutionary War. John Adams said that he and the fellow founding fathers would study war so that his son could study agriculture, and that he would study agriculture so that his son, John Adams' grandson, could study art. And while the context of that was essentially around the importance of winning the war, he was hinting at one important thing, which is essentially that we are doing work to solve a problem. And when we solve a problem, we do that, reducing human work essentially frees us up to do other things. This is progress. This is what we call progress. And eventually, if we can solve enough work, if we can invent technologies and focus our efforts in enough areas to reduce human work to a certain point, then we can get to the things that we are really actually good at, which is the creative and the cognitive. Those are the improvements. Those are our strongest features as a species. Now, as I'm recording this recently, AI-generated art has become a major talking point in the news lately. As a matter of fact, an AI-generated artwork just won an art contest. And so you hear that and you might think, okay, well, if we're so great at creative and cognitive, then how come computers can do art better than us? Well, first of all, that's not really the same thing. I don't think that AI-generated art is necessarily the mechanical act of creating art is not something necessarily that's creative and cognitive. And AI is a facsimile of creativity and cognition, right? And not to say that someday true AI won't exist, but what I'm essentially saying is my argument there would be that an AI-generated piece of art winning an art contest says a lot more about how we judge art and how art contests work than it does about the art itself. And if you keep following along this semester, eventually we will talk about AI-generated art and the nature of art and so on. But essentially, we want to focus on the creative and cognitive. That is our strongest suit. Essentially, we think, therefore it is. We being humanity and it being technology. Technology exists because we are great at creative and cognitive things. Now, there are three ways that technology influences human work. It can support, supplement, or enhance human work. And as I go through here, we can take a look at a technology called the automobile in order to illustrate these points. So when we say that technology supports our lives, what we're talking about is technology that improves the efficiency of human work. Technology that allows us to do more in less time, or to make more, create more, produce more with fewer resources, including time. Now, right now, we live in an age where most technology supports our work. And we can look at the evolution of that in the auto industry, because a long time ago, a man named Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. The automobile had been around. Henry Ford's innovation was interchangeable parts. So at the time, if you wanted to have a car, a single artisan or a team of artisans would individually create and craft and assemble all of the components in order to create an automobile, which means every automobile was essentially unique and took a great deal of time in order to create, and so on. Well, Henry Ford's innovation of interchangeable parts essentially meant that you could just create the parts and have individual people do assembly on certain components. If a component failed, then it could be replaced, and so on, and hence we have assembly lines and the mechanics industry, and so on. Now, as you can see here, in the 1950s, it seems, from the look of those Chevrolets, we have humans doing a lot of work. It's an assembly line, so if you look down the line, we have a lot of people doing a lot of things. And their jobs are essentially just to take components and assemble their specific piece of the car. Now, eventually we develop technology, and we can have technology do that for us, because human beings are not well suited for repetitive tasks. Now, it is sad, and of course an unfortunate side effect of the advancement of technology, that humans who once did tasks that can be done by technology, as someday essentially their labor becomes obsolete. Technology has evolved to the point where it's just more efficient just to simply have robots do it. And that is unfortunate. But I will remind you that human beings are not suited for repetitive tasks. That's not a strong suit for us. That's why we get repetitive stress injuries. And so I would say that the real problem here with technology eliminating jobs is not so much that technology is advancing to the point where that human work is no longer necessary. It's the fact that as a society, we don't have an answer for what happens when that occurs. The solution is certainly not to hold back the advancement of technology, because that's kind of counterintuitive. Essentially, what I'm getting at is that it is the essential ultimate goal of our species with technology to make our lives so convenient and easy that we can focus on other more important things. And if we're to do work, creative and cognitive tasks are really where we're best suited. So holding back that advancement really it benefits none of us in the long run. It's a very myopic sort of point of view to take. Instead, we should be answering the problem of what happens when that occurs in a way that is satisfactory for everyone involved. I think that is possible, but we'll talk about more that more later on this semester as well. But that is technology supporting human work, right? It increases the efficiency of the work. It allows us to focus on other things. In this case, the manufacture, assembly, programming, and maintenance of the robots that are building cars, and so on. Now, when we say that technology supplements our lives, what we're talking about here is technology that replaces human work, taking humans out of the equation. So in the car industry, those unfortunate auto workers who lost their jobs, well, that's because their work was supplemented by that technology. I probably got a little bit off book a moment ago, just to be sure that it's crystal clear. The technology in this case that supports human work is the automobile itself. We are, of course, capable of traveling on our own 2 feet or by various other means without too much of an issue, but it certainly makes it a hell of a lot easier and a lot more efficient if you have an automobile to travel. You can travel much farther, much easier. Now, we live on the cusp of a new era. where more and more of our technology is, instead of supporting our lives, is supplementing our lives, essentially taking humans out of the equation. And in the automobile industry, we see that with autopilot, self-driving cars. Pretty soon, if all goes well and we don't accidentally blow ourselves up and end the human race before then, a day is coming when cars will simply transport us, or public transportation, or whatever form this happens to take, transports us, and all of the human work of driving an automobile will no longer be an issue. And at times, technology is developed to enhance human work, or enhance our lives. And that is technology that allows humans to do work that would otherwise be impossible. And cars have plenty of these features. Pretty much any feature you can name on a car is going to enhance us, anything beyond, actual transportation. And it should also be noted that sometimes technology can do more than one of these things. Technology can support and enhance human work in different combinations. So technology can do more than one of those at a time, and also technology's role can change over time as well. Certain technologies can become obsolete. Certain technologies can become more important. They can go from enhancing our work to supplementing our work over time. So, for example, if we were to take a look at, let's say, the entertainment industry, right? So when talkies first came out, if you wanted to see a talkie, you had to go to a movie theater, and that required that was possible thanks to certain inventions like the projector and screens and so on. But that role has changed over time, and now streaming media services have not necessarily made movies obsolete, but have definitely changed their role. It used to be that if you wanted any entertainment at all, you had to go to a theater, and now it's seen as a different experience, right? The default experience, the one that most people have generally, is going to be streaming services, but on a smaller scale. People are still, of course, going to movies and to the theaters, but for different purposes. It's no longer because they have to, it's because they desire to see the film before it comes out in streaming services, or because of just the interest of going and seeing it on a larger screen, or the social activity of going with other people, and so on. So, society can change, rendering certain technologies obsolete without a technological advancement to replace it. Sometimes society just advances to the point where we no longer need something anymore, like drive-in movie theaters, for example. You might not think of a drive-in as being a technological innovation, but it certainly requires a novel combination of existing technologies, right? We have both the cinematography aspect of it, but then we also have the audiology aspect of it, and then the automobile aspect of it, the logistics aspect of it, and so on. And it's just one of those things where society it was in a different place, and it no longer saw the experience of drive-in movie theaters as being one that most people are really keen to experience. And so we see drive-ins closed left and right. And I think that there is maybe only one or two left in the entirety of the nation. And sometimes technologies will spring up that serve to fill a niche, but they just don't quite do it. Of course, we currently are on the cusp of the IoT generation. This is the technology that will supplement instead of support our lives. And of course, with that comes the possibility of many different things. But not all of those are necessarily going to be things that people will find to be desirable or necessary, and so on. For example, here we have a smart egg carton, and it will let you communicate via app on your phone to let you know when you're low on eggs, and so on. And maybe this is the kind of thing that will catch on. I certainly don't have a crystal ball, and I don't know what people are into these days. But I can tell you this seems like a solution in search of a problem, as they say. So, not in my opinion likely to be one of the things that catch on. However, a smart refrigerator that is able to detect what ingredients you have in your refrigerator or in your pantry, and maybe send you recommendations based on what you already have, for, let's say, what you can make for dinner tonight. That might be something that's practical, but the essential point here is that this is a solution in search of a problem, because this is very limited in scope to just eggs and requires, apps and so on that people just, I doubt, are willing to accept. But that said, a future date where you are traveling, sitting in your car, which is driving itself home, and then it sends you a message that says that it's time for an oil change, and so it has scheduled one for you, and it will go to the automated oil change center during non-peak hours while you are sleeping, so it takes care of it for you. And then it sends you a reminder that your refrigerator tells you that you're low on milk and eggs, but not to worry, because a delivery drone will be by later on with the necessary supplies, and so on. That is a day that is not science fiction. That is fast approaching. It will be here soon. So in short, we use technology to solve problems, even problems created by technology. So right now, with the current climate crisis, it is possible for us right now to completely reverse climate change. We just simply have to stop using all technologies that generate fossil fuel emissions and carbon emissions and so on. Just essentially stop using that technology. Go back to a essentially dark ages sort of technology, right? But that's not thinkable to us. We're simply, what are we going to do? Give up our memes, give up our streaming services, give up our automobiles, give up on modern production systems and infrastructure? It's unthinkable to us. And so we have a problem. And what do we turn to when we have a problem? Well, we turn to technology. We essentially use technology to solve problems, even problems that are created by technology. And so our answer for the climate change crisis is not to use less technology, but to use different technology, even more technology, in order to solve those problems, like hydroelectric and solar and wind farms. And technology is completely neutral morally. It doesn't have an agenda. It doesn't have a sense of good or evil or right or wrong. It simply is. And so whether we use more or less, or whether it's good or bad, these are not terms that apply to technology. They apply to the use of technology. And we will talk again about technology ethics later on this semester. But since we're on the topic of technology solving problems, let's talk about what problem the internet solves. If we talk about computers in general, what problems do computers solve? Well, that's easy. It's right in the name. It computes. They do other things that we're really bad at, like storing information and recalling it exactly, but, and playing games and whatnot. But essentially, it computes. That's what it does. It's able to do all of those other things because it can compute. But the internet, think about it for a second. What is the internet for? Well, as we come to the answer, I want you to keep in mind a quote from Benjamin Franklin when he asked, "What good is a newborn baby?" Right? In response to one of his own inventions, when asked, "What good is this?" he says, "What good is a newborn baby?" So what good is the internet? Well, we're going to look at some things here, and maybe it will jog your mind here as we proceed. If I were to show you these images, for example, or this one, or this one, or these. And if we go even farther back in time, if I were to show you this image, or if we go farther back still and I show you this one, an image burned into my adolescent mind. This is one of the first memes on the internet from way back in the early 90s. And you may think, okay, we're talking about memes. Would you be at all surprised if I told you that memes go much farther back than the internet? Like these. Or these. What we're looking at right here are pre-internet memes. Memes are just a way of sharing ideas, usually just quick jokes or humor. But if we were to analyze them, we would see that they are revealing at least of a certain something. They signify something. Like, for example, Frodo lives. If you're not familiar with that meme, you will find it written on desks all over the place in the 60s and 70s, 80s, and even 90s. It's still around a little bit today, but it was most popular then in the 60s and 70s. What does that say? Well, of course, these days, everyone knows Frodo from The Lord of the Rings. But those movies came out in the 2000s, and The Rings of Power is on Amazon as I'm recording this. But back in the 60s and 70s, it was not a well-known thing. It was something that only certain people in an in-group, right, really knew who that was. And in the 60s, there was a paperback release of the Tolkien's trilogy that had originally been published in the 1930s. And so it was essentially a border maintenance mechanism, a shibboleth, if you will, that people would identify if they were part of this in-group of people who had read The Lord of the Rings. Or essentially, it's nerds talking to each other, right? No, I don't mean any offense or anything with the use of that term. It just is what it is. And Kilroy here, this little guy in the blue circle, that is a symbol that's been drawn all over the place. Usually you see that, and maybe somewhere nearby it'll say Kilroy was here. It's just a milestone. It's just a meme that basically someone will tag and say, I was here. You know, just a little idea, something to leave behind, a way of reaching throughout time and space to other people. And even the ancient Romans, Sator repo tenet opera rotas. That is basically just a shibboleth as well, right? These kinds of word puzzles were not uncommon among the upper class, the landed gentry in ancient Rome. We see this sort of graffiti all over the place, in particular Pompeii, which is very well preserved due to Mount Vesuvius's eruption. We don't know much about it. And the reason we don't know much about it is because these memes, these ideas, they require some kind of cultural context. And unfortunately, in that case, cultural context is lost because we don't simply know everything about ancient Roman culture. But certain symbols are ubiquitous, like our ancient cave stick figure with a boner here. That is a uniquely human type of symbol, type of idea. And even though it is hundreds of, well, thousands of years anyway, removed from modern people, we could probably speculate with likely shocking accuracy exactly what the meaning is behind that. And then we have OK, O-K-A-Y. Now, is that the way that's supposed to be spelled? It's not. The spelling of OK as O-K-A-Y is actually an anachronism, because no word could possibly just be two letters, O and K, but it is. Excuse me. And this is an example of a meme that you may not understand at first, but once you provide context for it, it makes a little bit more sense, right? So OK is not O-K-A-Y, it is OK. And the reason that it is OK is because it's a confluence of two memes that coincided around the turn of the century. One of them is abbreviating things, and the other one is intentionally misspelling things. So OK is O-L-L, all, K-O-R-R-E-C-T, correct. And I know that now that I've explained it, it doesn't make any more sense to you, but now you know what it originally was. We've lost the context for it. We don't think that those things are funny anymore. We don't see why anyone would think that they're funny. Well, maybe if I explain a little bit, you'll understand. So in the 19th century, the United States here did not have a lot in terms of formal, standardized education. We didn't have core curriculum. We didn't have we barely even had school districts. We had informal teaching, no certifications, and so on and so forth. But there was a big push in the English language around this time to begin to standardize the language, particularly when it came to spelling. And so all of these children, essentially the younger generations, who had been fine with spelling whatever the hell if you look at, for example, letters home in the Civil War, there was no standardized spelling. They're very difficult to read. And it wasn't because they weren't educated, because there literally was no standard until the Oxford English Dictionary came out and started standardizing spelling. And so kids, being kids, of course, to get the goat of their teachers and parents and others, and to buck the authority that they felt that they were under, they would intentionally misspell things as a way to just kind of be annoying and to, again, act as a border maintenance mechanism, part of the in-group. The abbreviating thing also comes from this era, because, of course, abbreviations at the time were all over the place. This is a time around when tensions in Europe were high, and the United States was just essentially coming together and gelling. The Civil War finally fading, of course, that bringing a lot of acronyms to the forefront with USA and CSA, so on and so forth. So it just sort of became a thing at the time. Now, okay as a term is not, it is an Americanism, but it is a ubiquitous one. It's one that is almost a universally recognized symbol of affirmation in any language. So if you were speaking Russian or French, Spanish, maybe to a lesser extent, but I mean Spanish for certain, and so on, the word okay is understood to mean okay just about everywhere. And why is that? Well, again, we have to think about the world at that time. So while the United States was just congealing as a nation, having just come out of the Civil War, and now with World War I on the horizon, the old institutions of the old world were falling apart. France had undergone a revolution following our own. The October Revolution in Russia was right around the corner. So essentially, this was a time when American culture was what's known as a hegemony. It was the dominant culture. And so Americanisms transported very easily over there. And then once World War I began, of course, it transferred even easier because Americans were going overseas and sharing this culture with their old world compatriots. So, confluence of factors, an idea holds power. An idea can be shared. That's what a meme is. We use it for dumb jokes, but at its core, it's something more than that. We're sharing our culture. We're sharing ourselves. And that is the ability to implant an idea. And ideas can have power. They can change things. And if you don't believe that, just take a look at your clock. Why do we have 12 hours in a day? Why do we have 60 minutes in an hour? Why do we have 60 seconds in a minute? Those divisions don't make sense to us as modern people. It's because of ancient Babylon. That was their counting system. They're the ones who developed that technology. And that idea has followed beyond any lifetime of anyone who was around during those decisions, beyond the culture of the Babylonians as a hegemonic power, beyond oceans of time and different counting systems and different time systems and so on, to survive to this very day. So ideas can have influence. They can change things. They do change us. But that's not the question I asked. The question I asked, again to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, is what good is a newborn baby? Because what a newborn baby can do is precisely why the internet exists. Think about it just for a moment. What does a baby do? Now, logically, in order to survive, a child, any child of any species, must develop its primary survival mechanism as soon as possible. Right? I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but logically speaking, if a creature is to survive in this harsh and savage world, it must develop its primary survival mechanism as soon as possible. Now, human beings, we have a lot of advantages, right? We have executive functioning, large prefrontal cortex, big brains. But babies, have you ever tried to have a conversation with one? They're not that smart. We have opposable thumbs, which allows us to do all kinds of things like tool use. But have you ever tried giving a baby a hammer? They're not strong enough, and they also don't have any dexterity. We don't develop dexterity for months until after we're born. We also have preternatural endurance. We have the ability to essentially hunt down any creature on God's green earth like a scary Terminator. We can just jog after them leisurely for hours and hours until they get so tired they allow us to kill them. Is that not a terrifying thought? But have you ever tried submitting a baby into a marathon, they can't run. They can't run for a long time after they're born. So what good is a newborn baby? What do newborn babies do? What is, in fact, the first thing that we wait for them to do when they're first born? The answer is cry. And that is our primary survival mechanism. The knowledge, even the knowledge primordial, buried deep down in places that we don't quite reach with our conscious mind, but the knowledge that we can cry out and get help from other people. That is also the human work that the internet solves. Communication. Communication. The internet is just simply the best, and well, currently the best method of reducing the human work of communication that we have ever invented. And it is only the latest in a long line of inventions that do that. So the spoken word, for example, is an invention that reduces the human work of communication. It's a lot easier to speak and explain concepts than it is to simply bang rocks together and punch each other until somebody does what we want them to do. The written word is a way for us to communicate through time, date displacement. I can write something down and somebody years from now can read it. That lowers the human work of me having to live and pass that message on voice to ear. The telephone, the telegraph, the entire mail infrastructure, television, radio, so on and so forth. All of these simply inventions to support communication. Now, the internet lowers the human work, reduces the human work of communication in a number of very important ways. Number one, it lowers the transaction cost. The transaction cost is a subconscious calculation that we all do whenever we have to perform human work. It's essentially us trying to decide if something is worth the effort of doing. The human work in delivering a letter is pretty high in the old days, like, for example, the Pony Express. So if we wanted to communicate during the days of the Pony Express, we had to write the letter, we had to seal it, we had to pay the postage, we had to get it to a postman, the postman would carry it, and the horse would do most of the work, but the postman still had to do quite a bit of work here in order to deliver that letter. That's a high transaction cost, but it's a lot lower than, for example, what Phidippides had to do at the Battle of Marathon and running 26.5 miles to deliver a message. It also gives us the ability to speak with date displacement, which, just like books and other forms of the written word, we're able to essentially communicate through space, through time, and with the internet, we're also able to communicate essentially instantaneously globally. And finally, one of the most important but also most often overlooked ways that the internet has changed the way that we communicate is with facilitation or the decentralization of publishing authority. So prior to the internet, if you wanted to say something to a lot of people at once, you had to convince the right people that what you had to say was worth broadcasting. So you had to go to editors or producers or the record companies or movie producers, and you had to pitch them and sell them on the idea that your message was worth broadcasting. And that's why so many forms of traditional media died or were waning with the rise of the internet, because when that publishing authority was removed from them, well, it turns out that they weren't really all that important in the end anymore. So traditional print media died because all of a sudden anyone, without having to talk to an editor, could just go on the internet and publish their ideas to the entire world instantaneously and with almost no effort. That's huge. That is a huge change. So here we have just a simple timeline of essentially inventions that assist with our ability to communicate one way or another. Now, the thing with technology, as I said before, is that innovation stands on the shoulders of giants. And so what we also see is that technology increases the efficiency of human work, including the efficiency of innovation. So the more technology we have, the faster we tend to invent new things as well, which is why it took the telephone about 50 years from invention to proliferation, the television only 22 years, but the internet 7 years, and now the things on the internet like Facebook 2 years, mobile devices about 3 years or so, and so on and so forth. So we tend to improve as we improve. And what this also means is that essentially we have a major shift, not just in the technology and the efficiency of human work, but because communication is so central to our survival as a species and so important for various different social functions, that it has changed the face of society in ways that we did not necessarily fully appreciate at the time. So, for example, this isn't just about making communication better, because it changed the way we communicate. It changed the speed at which we communicated. It changes the amount of information that can be shared and from whom. And so the internet is not just a place for memes, it's also where our media markets and our economy essentially interact, where customers find products, where businesses offer products, a place where those two people can congregate. So shopping and entertainment and so on. It's where our constituents, our citizens, our civil society, and our political discourse. It's essentially our new public forum. So where citizens can connect with the ruling elite or with our elected representatives, where our representatives can get a sense of what the people want, where the people can send messages, and so on and so forth. It's what sets the agenda for our political systems. And it's also the cultural hub, not just of the United States anymore, but now the world. United States culture is United States culture, but we also have a global culture now, and it's part of everything and everyone, at least in terms of the only limiting factor, which is language, which is still a practical barrier to us. So it could be said that we have more of an English-speaking world type culture and a Spanish-speaking world type culture, and so on. But we will talk about cultural hegemony in a little bit. I think in the next lecture. But this is important because this is also where our information seeking and dissemination systems are. It's where our socialization takes place. So all of this has extreme broad-facing consequences. Now, of course, when we increase the efficiency of a system, we also increase the efficiency of flaws in that system. A lot is laid at the feet of the internet in terms of flaws. To say that, kids these days spend too much time on screens and they're terminally online and they say weird stuff and so on. But unfortunately, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the truth of the matter is that those are not problems usually with the internet itself. Usually they're problems in the system that's being improved. So the system of human communication has flaws. Like, for example, no matter how I'm communicating, I can lie. I can exaggerate. I can pass on less than truthful information and have other people share that less than truthful information. People can become obsessed with communication in any form, and so on. So, like, for example, much is made these days of the way that information is disseminated online, and they'll use terms like clickbait or fake news to decry the end of unbiased news. But I'm sorry, there has never been such a thing. There's never been such a thing as unbiased news. For example, all of this is simply the flaws in the human system of communication, which is complicated by capitalist factors, like, for example, the economic factors that go into and incentivize news dissemination. So, back in the turn of the century, after the Industrial Revolution, people were concentrated from the Jeffersonian ideal of agrarian yeoman farmers to urban hotspots. And that meant that people were essentially living and working in cities, and transportation in cities not being necessarily as important, but also simply more logistically difficult to handle. People essentially would walk to work or take public transportation, which meant that if you wanted to sell newspapers, the primary customer base that you would be reaching would be walking quickly down the street on their way to work, which meant that you could sell more papers by simply selling them on street corners and having paper boys holding up the papers saying, "Extra, extra, read all about it." Now, and shouting the headline, right? Now, the more salacious, the more tantalizing the headline, the more people would stop and buy a paper. If they're walking down the street and they hear a headline, "Extra, extra, read all about it. Greta Garbo crushes 2 watermelons between her knees," people are going to stop and they're going to want to buy that paper, because they want to know what the hell is going on. It doesn't even really matter if the article actually says anything about that, right? Because they just wanted to read the headline and find out what's going on with that. Now, We would call that clickbait today. Clickbait titles that are meant to draw you in and get the click, and then they get the financial reward, and then it doesn't matter if the article is true or not. Well, we used to call that yellow journalism. Now, at the end of the World War II, people left the cities. They started moving out to the suburbs. People weren't taking public transportation. Paperboys, they didn't have as many people to sell to. Instead, the economic model changed. People out in the suburbs would get their paper through subscription services. And so you didn't really want the clickbait titles anymore, because if people found out your paper was just drawing people in, you might sell one paper, but a subscription means that they have to keep paying for it. So you have to give them something that they want regularly. And so the economic incentives in the news dissemination industry changed, and so priorities changed. This is the era of the scoop. If you got the story first, then you were the paper of record, and people respected that and would subscribe to get the paper that got the news first. People also didn't want the salacious titles so much. There's also a term that comes from this era: if it bleeds, it leads, because there is a certain amount of morbid curiosity you want to throw in there. But generally speaking, there's more of an incentive to not publish stories that your viewership might take issue with or disagree with, because then they might cancel their subscription. So this is also where we get the feel-good stories, the human interest stories, and so on as well. Now, these days we might call that fake news, but it was around way before the internet, right? So essentially, there are other problems as well that are just kind of inherent in systems, just in general, regardless of what system we're talking about, right? Like, for example, here we're seeing a consequence of globalization here: cheesy crust and chicken wings no longer being available due to a cyber attack. But in general, there are certain problems. Like, for example, when human life becomes dependent on technology, that is kind of inherently a problem with the system. It's just that now the system is running off of a different technology and often requires different considerations for resiliency and redundancy in order to support human life. Or, essentially, there will be new ways for bad people to do bad things and good people to do dumb things whenever technologies evolve. So, for now, the last slide point I would like to leave you with here today is just essentially that security is always ultimately a human problem. Cybersecurity and traditional security both rely on humans. It is a human problem. And we can learn all of the technical controls, and we can buy all the fancy appliances, and we can, do this and that, and we can get all the certifications and everything. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about a human problem requiring a human solution. Cybersecurity as a discipline tends to see people as components in a security system, but that might be fair and accurate from certain perspectives, but it's not necessarily the best approach to solve some of these inherent flaws in these systems. We can't patch people, but we can teach people, but that itself is not a technical problem. It is a human problem. Teaching is a human problem, and it requires a lot of different factors. And as a teacher, I can tell you that, I give roughly the same information in most classes. I change things up, every year based on how things are working or how they're not, or how something is received or how it's not. But it's a human problem because, it's about chemistry. Sometimes me as a teacher and my style just doesn't jive in general with a class. And it depends on the class as well. I can tell you I'm a heck of a lot more effective teaching to people who understand English than I would be if you put me in a room of people who only speak Mandarin. I would not be an effective teacher because it's not about the technical skill. It's about humans. It's about how we relate to each other. It's about how we assimilate information. And another problem that we have in the industry is that while we acknowledge the weakness, we say, yes, humans are a problem. They're a flaw, and the most reliably exploited part of any security system is a human. We acknowledge that weakness, but we don't acknowledge the problem. We certainly don't have the skills in the industry in general to fix it. And that's why we're going to go through cybersecurity and society. That's why we're all here, and that's what we're going to be learning throughout the course of this semester. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Tune in soon for the part 2. We're going to move on to individual topics. So take care.